This training involves replenishing the cation resin in the cation resin cartridges. This training will explain: what are cation resin cartridges? Why do we need cation resin cartridges? Why must we change the cation resin in the cation resin cartridges? Who is responsible for replenishing the cation resin cartridges? How is it determined that the cation resin needs to be changed? What is the procedure for changing the cation resin in the cation resin cartridges? Cation resin cartridges are part of the cyclochemistry analysis equipment for the heat recovery steam generators, also known as HRSG, and steam turbine. Ammonia is added to HRSG feed water to increase pH. Not only does the added ammonia increase pH, it also increases water conductivity. The ammonia conductivity masks other unwanted water impurities that would increase conductivity and cause harm to the HRSG and steam turbine. The resin in the cation cartridges absorb the added ammonia, which is a cation, and the conductivity of the water without the added ammonia can be determined. Conductivity measurements taken after the removal of cation chemicals is referred to as cation conductivity. The cation resin becomes saturated with ammonia and becomes depleted and must be replaced with fresh cation resin periodically. The Unit 2 HRSG field operator is responsible for inspecting the cation resin in the cation resin cartridges at least once per shift, and is also responsible for replenishing saturated, depleted cation resin when needed. The first indication that the cation resin is saturated and depleted is unusually high conductivity readings on the cation conductivity measurement instrument. Using a visual inspection, depleted cation resin appears as dark amber in color. Active, non-depleted resin appears as dark purple in color. More than a quarter inch of active, non-depleted cation resin in the bottom of the cation resin cartridge is sufficient for proper operation. If it is determined that the cation resin of a cation resin cartridge is depleted, each cation resin cartridge is associated with a sample point, abbreviated SP. A number is written on the metal channel behind each cation resin cartridge. This number corresponds to the sample point number. The flow is stopped by closing the flow control valve on the flow rater of the associated cation resin cartridge labeled cation conductivity or cation/degas conductivity. Remove the vinyl tubing from the barbed tubing fitting on the top and bottom of the cation resin cartridge by gently pulling on the vinyl tubing at the barb with enough force to successfully remove the vinyl tubing. Residual water in the panel tubing and in the cation resin cartridge will drain from the tubing and the cation resin cartridge into the panel catch pan. This is not abnormal and should be expected. Remove the cation resin cartridge by depressing the cartridge clamps until the barbs on the clamp disengage. When releasing the cation resin cartridge clamps, do not allow the cation resin cartridge to fall into the panel catch pan, as this will damage the tubing barb fitting on the bottom of the cation resin cartridge. Pull on the disengaged flap until the cation resin cartridge is loose. Slide the cartridge up and out of the loosened clamps. Install the removed cation resin cartridge into the cartridge holding apparatus by opening the semicircular jaws enough to insert the cation resin cartridge. When inserting the cation resin cartridge into the cartridge holding apparatus, do not allow the cation resin cartridge to fall onto the surface below, as this will damage the tubing barb fitting on the bottom of the cation resin cartridge. Position the bottom tubing barb fitting towards the sink. The cartridge holding apparatus was strategically installed near the sink to facilitate the safe and efficient draining of any residual water in the cation resin cartridge while undergoing resin replenishment operations. Tighten the semicircular jaws sufficiently to securely hold the cation resin cartridge. Do not over-tighten the cartridge holding apparatus. Although highly unlikely due to the superior design of the cartridge holding apparatus, damage may occur to the cation resin cartridge. Take note of the orientation of the top barb in relation to the bottom barb. When later reinstalling the top cap, the barb should point in relatively the same direction. Once the cation resin cartridge has been securely installed into the cartridge holding apparatus, use the small strap wrench to remove the top cap of the cation resin cartridge. Remove the cation resin cartridge from the cartridge holding apparatus by loosening the semicircular jaws. Pour the used, depleted cation resin from the cation resin cartridge into the 5-gallon bucket labeled as used cation resin, stored near the sink. A word of caution: any cation resin inadvertently spilled on the floor should be thoroughly removed immediately. Resin material is formulated into small hard beads that are extremely slippery. A broom and dustpan are stored near the cartridge holding apparatus to facilitate spilled resin removal. Exercise extreme caution during the spilled resin removal process. Use the spray bottle of demineralized water to rinse any residual used, depleted resin into the 5-gallon bucket labeled as used cation resin. Reinstall the empty cation resin cartridge into the cartridge holding apparatus by opening the semicircular jaws enough to insert the cation resin cartridge. Do not over-tighten the cartridge holding apparatus. Use the specially modified funnel to add new cation resin to the cation resin cartridge. If there are any partially used bags of cation resin, use that resin first. If an unopened bag of resin is required, use the scissors stored near the resin bucket to open the new resin bags. The scissors provided are designed to be used by personnel aged 4 years and older. It would be very difficult to cause injury to yourself using these scissors. It is also difficult to open the resin bags using the provided scissors, but as always, safety first. Fill the cation resin cartridge to approximately 1/4 to 1/2 inch below the threads at the top of the cation resin cartridge. If there is any resin remaining in the resin bag after sufficiently filling the resin cartridge, use the bag clamp provided to seal the unused portion in the resin bag and store it in the new resin bucket. Empty, new cation resin bags should be disposed of in the trash, not in the used cation resin bucket. Use the resin cartridge tamping tool to pack the resin by inserting the tamping tool into the cation resin cartridge and exerting about 1 pound of force onto the cation resin. The top surface of the resin should appear flat and uniform. Use the spray bottle of demineralized water to clean any cation resin from the top cap threads. Reinstall the top cap of the cation resin cartridge. Tighten until the orientation of the barb is close to where it was when removing the top cap. Tighten the top snugly, hand tight. Do not use the strap wrench to tighten. Reinstall the cation resin cartridge into the cation resin cartridge clamps by sliding the cartridge into the clamps. Tighten the clamps by squeezing the clamps sufficiently to allow the barbed surface to catch with enough pressure to suspend the cation resin cartridge when full of water. Reconnect the vinyl tubing onto the barbed connections by gently pushing the vinyl tubing onto the barbed connection. Re-establish water flow by opening the flow control valve on the flow rater. Adjust the flow control valve on the flow rater to provide a 100 to 200 cubic centimeters per minute flow. A word of advice: if the water flow is set to 100 cubic centimeters per minute instead of 200 cubic centimeters per minute, the cation resin will effectively last twice as long and will need to be replenished less often, saving both time and cation resin. Also, Not filling a cation resin cartridge to full capacity causes the cartridge to saturate and deplete quicker, making resin replenishment more frequent and causing more work for the Unit 2 HRSG field operator. And, last but not least, the analyzer specialist usually empties the used cation resin bucket. But, in the unlikely event that the analyzer specialist is unable to perform this important task, do not dispose of the used cation resin with regular trash. Dispose of the used cation resin only in the refuse pile located near the northwest corner of the slag pile that goes to the Okeechobee Class 1 non-hazardous waste landfill. This concludes the training on replenishing cation resin in the cation resin cartridges. If you have any questions, please feel free to view this video again. Thank you. I hope you have enjoyed this training.